Hello, and welcome back to Missouri Civil War. Today we return to the fall of 1861 and pick up with the story of the Missouri State Guard after the rebel victory at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. The following month, General Sterling Price moved northward, advancing upon the Missouri River town of Lexington. The battle at Lexington was part of a larger struggle during the first year of the war to gain and keep control over the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. We'll turn our attention to Ulysses S. Grant, who became one of the North's great heroes during the war. It was a career whose ascent began in Missouri. We'll also look at Grant's part to control the Mississippi and to eliminate the rebel menace in the state's south and east. Finally, we'll conclude with the efforts of two men, Primus Emerson and James Eads, to build a better kind of gunship. Their ironclad gunships were central to this battle for the rivers, and their rivalry shows us how intimately connected people in the small world of wartime Missouri could be. Victory at Wilson's Creek left Sterling Price flush with confidence. With Nathaniel Lyon dead and his army forced to retreat to Rolla, the Missouri State Guard now seemed poised to reclaim much of the state. Price thus moved northward, attracting eager recruits as he went. The Guard, he noted, increased hourly in numbers and enthusiasm. Financial considerations also factored into his decision to move upon Lexington. Price and Governor Claiborne Jackson hoped to secure funds that had been deposited in Lexington's bank before they could be removed by federal troops. In 1857, a law expanding the banking system of Missouri had required the establishment of new banks in the state's largest slaveholding counties, including Lafayette, of which Lexington was the seat. Price, I should note, had been the state banking commissioner at that time and thus was a key figure in administering this new law. So in September 1861, Price intended to seize these funds so they could not be confiscated by federal forces and to use them to help fund and supply his own army. Price's column reached Lexington on the afternoon of September 12th. The total size of his rebel army neared 12,000 men eventually. Together, they faced a federal garrison of roughly 2,700 men, most of whom had withdrawn to the town's Masonic College. The garrison commander was Colonel James Mulligan, a New York native and the leader of the 23rd Illinois Volunteers, a unit often described as the Irish Brigade. The Lexington College sat atop a steep hill and was surrounded by earthworks and pits that had been constructed by the Union troops. Mulligan attempted to hold this fortified position, hoping that John C. Fremont would soon send him reinforcements from St. Louis. For several days, no real fighting took place. On September 17th, the women and the children of Lexington fled the town for refuge in the surrounding countryside. The following morning, Price, with all of his men now in place, advanced in force upon the federal garrison. Much of the fighting that followed focused upon the home of Oliver Anderson, a two-story brick building that sat high above the Missouri River and had been used as a makeshift hospital. The Anderson house, once Price's men secured it at last, became the stronghold from which they launched their assault upon the federal position. Mulligan's hoped-for reinforcements had not yet arrived. Fremont remained preoccupied with enemy movements along the Mississippi River to his south. Price's movements in central Missouri were apparently a lesser concern. It wasn't until September 15th that Fremont had grasped the significance of Price's advance. By then, the Missouri State Guard was already at Lexington. It took another 3 days before Fremont tried to concentrate Union forces in the area, but at that point, the prospects for Mulligan were grim. The rebel siege and sharpshooters pinned the Federals to the Masonic College. On September 19th, Price's men seized large hemp bales from the riverside warehouses of McGrew, Anderson, and Sedgwick. Rolling them slowly uphill, the rebels used the hemp bales as a moving breastworks. They'd soaked them with water, and so they wouldn't catch a flame, and they just moved them steadily up the hill, holding off Union fire. Mulligan ultimately decides that he has no choice but surrender. In the fighting at Lexington, Price lost 100 of his men. The Federals, meanwhile, lost half of their garrison, roughly 1,700. Soon enough, Fremont's reinforcements steamed up the Missouri River, some 38,000 men. This left Price with few options but to withdraw southward from Lexington. The Missouri State Guard, he realized, lacked the men, the armaments, and the supply to hold the Missouri River against this federal advance. So the Guard retreated southward again. Its numbers now steadily dwindled. Winter, as Ned Stark would remind us, was coming. By the time the Guard, which had grown to 18,000 men, crossed the Osage River, its ranks had dwindled to some 7,000. And I should point out that as they're crossing the Osage Valley, the rebels did not cross paths with the Jayhawker Brigade of Jim Lane that I talked about in the last video. Lane's men had been raiding in the Southerners' rear. This turn of events rankled Price. He faulted Ben McCulloch for not supporting him in this advance upon Lexington. He criticized Jefferson Davis for not offering greater aid to Missouri Confederates. The Federals' hold now upon the Missouri River seemed secure, if only for the moment. To the south and the east, the Union control of the Mississippi was even less secure. The Civil War career of Ulysses S. Grant began in Missouri. As a resident of the river town of Galena, Illinois, he ventured slightly downstream with a contingent of volunteers to Palmyra, Missouri. Grant's first assignment was to provide protection for workers who were rebuilding the Salt River Bridge of the Hannibal and St. Joseph Railroad across northern Missouri. Rebels had destroyed it. Grant quickly won the respect of Union leaders and local citizens for his ability to impose greater discipline among his troops. In July, Grant was appointed Brigadier General and put in charge of federal troops at Ironton, the railhead on the Iron Mountain Railroad just south of St. Louis. There he prepared to confront rebel troops under William Hardee, which had taken Fredericktown and posed a continued danger to Union control in the southeast. Grant was put in command of the territory south of St. Louis, including Missouri and Illinois, and he moved his headquarters to Cape Girardeau and then across the river to Cairo, Illinois. On September 5th, Federal scouts informed Grant that 4,000 rebel troops were likely to move from Columbus, Kentucky to Paducah, near the confluence of the Tennessee and Ohio rivers. A day later, Grant took Paducah with just 2 regiments. Claiborne Fox Jackson and Sterling Price, encouraged by their success at Wilson's Creek and then at Lexington, hoped that the Confederacy might move aggressively to strengthen its northern border in Missouri. Albert Sidney Johnston, who led the Confederate Western Department, looked upon Missouri as a lesser priority. He instead focused upon strengthening rebel positions on the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers. Missouri mattered, of course, but mostly to the extent that it diverted federal troops and resources from the fight to the south and east. In October, Johnston gave his approval to a plan by Missouri General Jeff Thompson, the so-called Swamp Fox, to move northward toward Cape Girardeau. They would there not only harass Federals and try to win recruits, but they might even seize the valuable lead mines of the eastern Ozarks. Thompson's raid pushed as far north as Jefferson County, which is just south of St. Louis. After a clash at Fredericktown resulted in a modest Union victory, Thompson's men marched back to New Madrid, just miles below the Confederate garrison at Columbus. Confederate efforts in southeast Missouri are hampered largely by the inability to coordinate their actions. The Confederate commander there was Major General Leonidas Polk. He lacked military experience. He had served as an Episcopal bishop before the war. He'd been a West Point graduate, but he owed his position largely to a personal friendship with Jefferson Davis. Polk hoped that Columbus, Kentucky would serve as a Confederate bulwark along the Mississippi. Across the river in Missouri, there sat a rebel encampment at Belmont, which would serve as an observation point. On November 7th, flashing forward just a little bit, Grant attacked Gideon Pillow's forces at Belmont with 5 regiments of Illinois and Indiana troops, a total of about 2,500 men. This was Ulysses Grant's first Civil War battle, and it proved largely inconclusive. At one point, Grant had a horse shot out from under him, but he soon rejoined the fight and was the last soldier to board the Union ships as they retreated back to Cairo. The fight at Belmont did at least reveal a couple of things. First, it exposed Confederate weaknesses along the river, especially their challenge and difficulty in coordinating the actions of various forces. And second, it was an early sign of Grant's aggressiveness. Here was a Union leader, as Lincoln would later say, who would fight. This trait would again be evident in the next year. But before we come to that, let's shift our attention to two men, Primus Emerson and James Eads, whose race to build a better ship proved central to this developing fight. Before the Civil War, Primus Emerson had made a successful career in St. Louis, building and repairing steamboats. He held a large stake in the Carondelet Marine Railway and Dock Company, just on the city's south side. Emerson oversaw the construction of that facility, and he developed a patented system for using submerged railways to haul vessels ashore for repair. This Carondelet facility, you could argue, becomes perhaps the single most valuable physical resource within the state of Missouri for the entire war. Yet in 1861, for reasons that remain somewhat unclear, Emerson decides to side with the Confederacy. He moves downriver to Memphis, Tennessee. In his absence, a civil engineer named James Eads rents that Carondelet dockyard. He exploits it to great success. When the federal government opened bidding for the contract to build 7 armored gunships in August 1861, Eads, who was a close friend of Edward Bates, Lincoln's Attorney General, also from Missouri, Eads wins this contract. The completed ironclads would boast 13 guns, with 3 on the bow, 2 on the stern, and 4 on each side. And how they often worked was that during offensive maneuvers, the ironclads often steamed in circles, firing repeated broadsides from their 4 cannon sides. The ship's armor was a considerable defensive advantage. Bolted to the oak frame, these iron plates could withstand considerable firepower from both riverside artillery and troop concentrations. These ships held a crew of 159 sailors and several officers. Many of these sailors were seasoned rivermen before the war. Many others had come from New York and eastern cities. Several others were foreign-born, with a large number coming from Ireland. And in time, escaped slaves would also serve on these boats. By October 1861, the dockyard's first ship, also known as the Carondelet, was ready to launch. Back to Grant. In February 1862, he moved upon the Confederate position at Fort Henry in Tennessee with 8,000 men. With support from Eads's ironclads, Union troops enjoyed a decisive victory. Days later, Grant's forces moved upon the rebels at Fort Donelson. Although artillery fire damaged Union gunboats, Confederates surrendered that post too on February 16th. Barely a week later, Union troops under John Pope attacked the rebel stronghold at New Madrid. Pushing through the area's swamps left an impression upon the Federals. Recalled Pope, "We waited and trudged for 3 of the most disagreeable days I ever passed." His men skirmished and scattered Jeff Thompson's much smaller forces, and after a siege of New Madrid, the town and its impressive stores, left behind by the fleeing rebels, fell to the Union. New Madrid sat along the Mississippi, and near it was Island Number 10. It was so named because it was the 10th island south of the mouth of the Ohio River. It was at a sharp turn and was critical to Union hopes of blockading the river. This bend looked like a sideways S, with New Madrid sitting near the bottom of the first curve, and Island Number 10 near the top of the second. In order to bypass rebel batteries, the Federals would build a canal above the island, but this only allowed them to move men, but not heavy gunboats. After 2 weeks of bombarding Island Number 10, Union leaders will boldly send the Carondelet down the Mississippi, past fierce rebel fire. This proved to be one of the most dramatic moments in this war for the rivers. But the ship made it, and then others followed. 2 days later, the Confederates stranded at the island surrendered. In addition to almost 7,000 prisoners, Union troops seized more than 120 pieces of artillery and a stunning quantity of arms and ammunition. For the Union military, these victories secured the Mississippi along the length of Missouri's eastern border. Such control helped to isolate Missouri from the rest of the Confederacy further east. It also opened up Tennessee and the Cumberland and other river tributaries, and it helped Federal troops push farther into the South. For Northern observers, this string of Western victories also marked a hopeful counterpoint to early defeats at Wilson's Creek and at Bull Run. For Grant, these experiences sparked his remarkable ascent. This eventually will make him Lincoln's top general, and after that, President of the United States. Finally, an epilogue, which returns us to our old friend Primus Emerson. After leaving St. Louis, he arrived in Memphis and essentially started from scratch. He nonetheless was able to launch an ironclad of his own, the CSS Arkansas. That ship was smaller than Eads's Carondelet, but in July 1862, these two vessels clashed further south on the Yazoo River. The Arkansas proved victorious, inflicting heavy damage upon the Union ship and breaking through the Union blockade at Vicksburg. By this point, however, the Union's control of the great rivers north in Missouri was secure. And a year later, that vital point along the river, Vicksburg, would likewise be theirs. For next time, we look to the larger implications of the Union's hold of these rivers. Prospects looked relatively bright in early 1862, but it remained clear that Federal control elsewhere was still precarious. Until then.